Arthropods are a phylum of animals that grow by molting their exoskeleton and have segmented bodies and paired, jointed appendages. The bulk of animal life is arthropods. They are a huge group of organisms that includes spiders and insects, among many others. Insects in particular comprise a huge and varied class. Only a small portion of insect species have been recognized, studied, or named, and it is estimated that there are as many as 6 to 10 million species of insects. They are undoubtedly the little things that run the world. Unfortunately, many of them will go extinct before we ever have the chance to know about them or what they do. Over 40% of insects are threatened with extinction within the next few decades. What scientists are finding is that the populations around the world have already declined between 30 and 76%, with the decline in North America being around 51%. Studies are documenting population declines of at least 1 and in some cases over 3% per year around the world. And at first this may sound like a good thing: fewer bugs, fewer garden and agricultural pests. But these creatures are the structural and functional base of the world's ecosystems. They are an integral part of every food web. They are food for birds, bats, reptiles, fish, amphibians, and even humans, and they play vital roles such as pollination, pest control, and nutrient cycling. Insects break down organic matter such as fallen leaves, timber, animal feces, and carcasses. They help aerate the soil, disperse seeds, and provide silk and honey. All told, their services are worth a minimum of $57 billion a year in the U.S. alone. 87% of all plant species and approximately 75% of crops grown by humans require animal pollination, the vast majority of which is carried out by insects. And about 20% of agricultural pollination is done by wild bees, not honeybees. Worldwide, these pollination services are estimated to be worth $235 to $577 billion per year. The fact that these organisms are fading fast should be big news. How is it that more people don't know? Some of the lack of awareness can be attributed to shifting baseline syndrome. Young people don't recognize there's been a drastic decline because they never saw larger populations when they were young. Likewise, people raised and living in cities don't realize there has been a decline because their experiences are with those species that thrive within cities. Similarly, people that have moved from one location to another may not realize there has been a decline because they have no basis for comparison as to what populations historically looked like in that area. This massive decline is a problem for so many reasons, not the least of which is that we simply do not know what each insect does. We have not even given a name to the large majority of species, let alone studied what ecological roles they might perform. As Aldo Leopold said, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts. But it's not just the arthropods. We are currently in the midst of an anthropogenically driven loss of biodiversity, also called the Sixth Great Mass Extinction. There are declines in both species and populations worldwide. This means that there are both declines in the number of species per given area and in the number of individual organisms of each species. In 2018, the World Wildlife Fund and Zoological Society of London released their Living Planet report, which estimated that the abundance of the world's wild vertebrates, which includes fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds, fell by 60% between 1970 and 2014. And these are the ones we are most aware of. We've lost a plethora of rodents, frogs and salamanders, elk, deer and gazelles, wolves, sea lions, seals and whales, bats and foxes, and here on the U.S. East Coast, the Carolina parakeet, great auk, and ivory-billed woodpecker. But for invertebrates, including arthropods, it's even worse, and most losses go without much notice or fanfare. But a land without insects is a land without most forms of higher life. Birds have been hit especially hard by the decline in arthropods. Of all the terrestrial bird species in North America, 96% of them rely on arthropods to feed their young. Think about that. 96% of land birds cannot raise the next generation if they don't have enough insects to feed their young. The decline in birds is nothing new. In the early 1990s, a study in a relatively undisturbed, unfragmented, mature forest in New Hampshire found the number of birds declined from about 215 individuals per 25 acres in the early 70s to around 80 per 25 acres in the 90s. And in 2004, conservationists at Stanford University stated that 1/4 of all bird species will be functionally extinct within a century. What is going on? What is causing all this collapse? There are many contributing factors, including habitat change and loss, agricultural expansion, pesticide, herbicide, and synthetic fertilizer use, introduced species, air, water, and light pollution, and climate change. Species diversity is a function of available, suitable habitat, and there is just not enough intact habitat left for most of our species to avoid extinction. Research has shown that it's a 1-to-1 ratio. If 50% of land is no longer native habitat, we will eventually lose 50% of the species that once resided there, and at this point, there isn't much space left that is native habitat. A 2018 study of Carolina chickadees found that these birds can only survive in an area if at least 70% of the plant population is native plants. How many places left still have at least 70% native plants? As of 2003, only about 3 to 5% of land in the contiguous 48 states remained undisturbed. Well over half of our land is now cities and suburbs, and grass lawns now make up at least 40 million acres in the United States. As far as wildlife is concerned, the U.S. has shrunk to about 1/20th of its original size. This has led to estimates that once extinction of animals catches up with the amount of functional land that remains, something that will likely happen in your lifetime, we will have lost 95% of the species that were here when the Pilgrims showed up. As of 2006, around 15% of the Amazon basin had been logged, whereas over 70% of the forests along the U.S. eastern seaboard are gone. Both of these statistics are problematic. Of course, there are national parks and forests, preserves and easements, but that percentage of space is not adequate to prevent the predicted loss of species. Why does this matter? Ecosystems work better and are healthier and more resilient when they are more biologically diverse. They are better able to withstand infections, invasions, and other disruptions. Diversity gives the environment more options for rebounding and rebalancing. And healthier ecosystems produce more. They filter more water, sequester more carbon. They produce more fish, more lumber, more oxygen. They are better able to absorb and soften the effects of large weather events like hurricanes, floods, and droughts. Biodiversity literally sustains us. The rivet analogy is commonly used to describe why biodiversity is important. Imagine an ecosystem as an airplane, with different aspects and species represented by different parts of the plane. We just lost the last northern white rhino. There went a seat. In this analogy, some rivets could fall out here and there, and it might not be a big deal. But if enough rivets fall out, say ones that are holding on a wing or an engine, even if the bulk of the plane is intact, it won't stay in the sky. Plants and arthropods are our rivets. And recall that we don't even know what roles and services millions of insect species provide. If we lose too many of the insects that break down leaves and down timber, our forests would fill and wildfires would increase. What about the beetles that are in decline, that are responsible for breaking down animal dung and carcasses? What happens when they disappear? And the pollinators? or the predatory arthropods that keep the pests in check. Doug Tallamy, an entomologist at the University of Delaware, has said, "We can no longer hope to coexist with other animals if we continue to wage war on their homes and food supplies. We must shrug off the adversarial relationship with nature that worked for our ancestors but is deadly to us. We must accept the new reality that how each one of us treats our biological heritage impacts not just us but our neighbors and our neighbors' neighbors. The need to destroy the life around us will be replaced by the ethical imperative to sustain it. Fortunately, nature is malleable, resilient, and forgiving. It will give us one last chance." We know that plants are primary producers and the base for almost all food webs on Earth. But it is their ability to support herbivorous insects, and 37% of the world's species are herbivorous insects, that carry most of the energy up a food web. If a plant does not actively contribute to the web, it is taking the place of one that would. And this is where you come in. The plants we grow in our gardens have the critical role of sustaining, directly or indirectly, all of the animals with which we share our living spaces. Now is a time, more than ever before, that each person, in the decisions they make for their yard or garden, can truly make a difference. The balance of our nation's biodiversity can be tipped one way or the other by what we choose to plant or not in our yards. Plants can be divided into categories multiple ways, but let's go with Tallamy and state that a plant that has fed nothing has not done its job. So which plants feed things? All of them? Certainly somewhere they do. But insect herbivores can only eat the plants they have evolved to eat. It takes a long time, not a few years but thousands of years, for insects to adapt to the specific chemical mixes that characterize different plants. Insects have also had to develop the ability to find their specific host plant and to have a life cycle in sync with those plants. While developing this intimate fellowship with some, many insects have simultaneously lost, or just not gained, an ability to tolerate the chemical mixes in other plants. About 90% of insect herbivores are specialists, meaning that they are particular about their host plant and can only develop on a few particular plant families or species. And of those, 60% are so specialized that they can only develop on one plant species. So for those extreme specialists, without that plant, that insect is history. This is where the importance of native versus introduced plant species comes into play. Introduced species are those which have been brought to an area from somewhere else, and not usually meaning from the next county over, from far enough away that they are in a completely different ecosystem. In our case, introduced species often come from Europe or Asia. Many introduced species were brought here intentionally by the horticultural trade specifically because they are inedible to our insects. Garden centers proudly advertise certain plants as being pest-free. And it is true, not much, sometimes no insects at all, can eat many of these introduced species. Most introduced plants do not contribute to their community. Unfortunately, once planted, these introduced species don't stay put. Bird and deer eat the seeds and berries. Seeds travel by wind or on fur, or plants send out rhizomes and suckers. Even when they appear to stay in your yard, these introduced plants take up residence all over. With no natural pests to keep them in check, they proliferate on roadsides and on our fields and forests. They take up space and choke out native species that now have to contend with supporting a larger burden of the insect population and fight introduced plants for space. Some introduced species don't just spread, they become invasive, spreading to the degree that they cause harm to other species, the environment, or both. The number of herbivores associated with introduced species here is only a small fraction of the complex natural enemies that kept those plants in check and their place of origin, and there are over 50,000 introduced plant and animal species in North America. Some of the worst pests we have to contend with slipped in unnoticed via the horticultural trade. These are often generalist species that eat everything in their path, like Japanese beetles, or they are so specific that they have or are in the process of decimating the entirety of a population. Native insect species simply will not survive on a landscape dominated by introduced plant species. In general, introduced plants that are unrelated to any local native plants reduce caterpillar richness and abundance by at least 75%. A study of insect abundance compared a hedgerow planted with at least 95% native plants to a hedgerow containing at least 75% introduced plants. Results showed that the hedgerows populated with introduced plant species contained 68% fewer caterpillar species, 91% fewer caterpillars overall, and 96% less caterpillar biomass than native hedgerows. But surely arthropods will adapt over time. Some plants have been here since the Pilgrims came, or are closely related to species that are native here. Well, yes and no. There are some closely related introduced plants that do a great job of supporting native arthropods. However, far and away, this is not the case. The prickly pear cactus supports 16 species in its country of origin, but none here in the U.S., and it's been here for over 250 years. Phragmites australis, a wetland grass, supports over 170 species in Europe, but only 5 here, and it's been here for over 300 years. Because of the lack of pests, it's taken over and crowded out the native Phragmites species and its associated insects and the animals that fed on them. The paperbark tea tree supports 409 species in Australia, but only 8 here. It's been in Florida since the early 1900s, and in that short time, this tree has fundamentally changed the Florida Everglades, crowding out the river of grass that used to define the Everglades. And along with the native grasses went most of the insects, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. And most of us have seen what some of the introduced scrambling and vining species like kudzu, Japanese honeysuckle, can do. Think for a minute about some introduced species you may be familiar with: Japanese maples, crepe myrtle, bamboo, nandina, Chinese privet. In general, when you look at these species, you will find little to no leaf damage. Now certainly some generalists, like Japanese beetles or gypsy moths, will eat some of these, but in general, introduced plant leaves are curiously unharmed because they are not contributing to the food web. Many people are familiar with the push to plant pollinator-friendly plants. However, this is only part of the equation and really misses a vital piece of the picture. Bees and adult butterflies and moths drink nectar or eat pollen for energy, and many insects can utilize the pollen or nectar from a variety of plants. However, it is the larval stage that is most specific about its host plant, and there can be no butterflies nor moths without the host plants for their larvae. Many non-native plants can and do serve as nectar sources, which unfortunately leads some to think they're helping out when they plant these species. However, these flowering introduced species are often planted in place of natives, thus taking up a spot and crowding out the native plants. Butterfly bush is a great example of this. This beautiful bush grows well and is often covered in insects nectaring away. It certainly looks like a productive member of the community. But the ever-popular bush hosts 0 butterfly or moth larvae in North America. And although it's not an aggressive spreader, these plants do spread and are becoming increasingly common in the wild, displacing more productive and beneficial natives. A species that has gotten a lot of media attention lately is the monarch. This beautiful butterfly can only be hosted by milkweed. The adults can get nectar from many flowers, but only about 20 milkweeds can support the caterpillars. No milkweed, no monarchs. Berry-producing bushes are frequently planted because they are billed as great support for bird populations, and bright red berries are pretty. Again, the problem is that although yes, adult birds do eat the berries, many of these introduced berry bushes offer nothing for the birds to feed their young in the way of insects. These bushes take the place of plants that would do both, and in fact, it is precisely the berries that make these plants so invasive. Birds and deer eat the berries and then deposit seeds far and wide. And given the option between flowers on native versus introduced species, insects almost always prefer native flowers. Just because a plant can grow in your yard does not mean it should. The climate may be similar to its home climate, but has not co-evolved with the other plants and animals in your area. A plant can only be considered a true native if it is from your ecoregion or somewhere close by, and, most importantly, once planted, it is able to become a functioning and interactive part of the community. Whenever possible, straight species, historically from your ecoregion, are the best bet. Native plants are also well suited to their ecological niche, and so when growing in the correct habitat, are often much easier to grow than their introduced alternatives. Less fertilizer, less watering, less work. Native plants have evolved with our native arthropods, birds, and other species into a system of checks and balances. Not only do arthropods feed on plants and feed birds, but there are many predatory arthropods that help to keep the herbivorous insect population in check. Although perhaps a bit counterintuitive at first, to control insect herbivores, you must maintain a population of insect herbivores so that you can attract and maintain the predators that will keep them in check. You cannot expect to have a healthy population of beneficial arthropods without first having enough food to support them. This means that it can take a few years for all the right creatures to find your native plantings and reproduce. The plant eaters show up first. We must leave them and wait for the predators to find them, or they will never show up. Diversity, as a simple count of the number of species in an area, can be misleading. True diversity is not realized unless the species are functioning, interacting, and contributing members of the biological web. On this planet, plants are not an option, and insects are essential. In the words of Doug Tallamy, for the first time in its history, gardening has taken on a role that transcends the needs of the gardener. Like it or not, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. It is now within the power of the individual gardener to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference. In this case, the difference will be to the future of biodiversity, to the native plants and animals of North America and the ecosystems that sustain them. There are lots of great resources available. Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, is a fabulous resource for further information on these topics. The Missouri Botanical Garden has a very useful website with a searchable database loaded with information about native plants. Likewise, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has a similar user-friendly and information-packed website. There are free ID apps. Seek by iNaturalist can help to ID both plants and animals on the spot. This is fun and very helpful when you're first getting started learning what is what. If gardening isn't your thing, but you like bugs and critters, there are a number of citizen scientist initiatives and classroom monitoring programs that you or your class could get involved in. Check out the links at the end of this video for more information.